Welcome everybody. This is the third installment of our Spring 2016 Teaching Excellence series. The first two installments have been more about the technology that we use in our classrooms, whereas the last two seminars will be more of a philosophical or existential exploration into teaching. So I would like to welcome Dr. Scott Minar. He's going to be presenting his presentation called The Big Revamp, Starting Over, Sort of. So, Dr. Minar.
Thank you so much, Paul. I'll just say a few things about this case study I promised in my title, which is, of course, me, and what happened to me. I hadn't thought, I've done these kind of things before, as I know many of you have as well. I didn't think I really wanted to do one, except it seemed fortuitous, and that I had a recent wrestling match with teaching. And I thought, well, that's worthwhile maybe. I know Ping Yuan will cover some of the usual teaching problems, or hopefully not usual, but more commonly observable ones. I'll tell you my story in half a second, but just to frame this for you, my problem was that my strength overcame me as a teacher. So it's with bitter irony, that I can report that I relied too heavily on strength, and that ended up messing with me. I'll tell you the whole thing now, but I wanted to make just a couple of points about the discipline of English teaching, which I know you all love, or at least you're nice to me about it. So I was thinking this morning that English professors don't teach a single discipline. I know we all teach different aspects of our own disciplines, but in English I find them, at least from my perspective, which I admit is subjective, to be particularly segmented. So for example, most people who go into English study, even as undergraduates, do that because they love to read. And not just that they love to read, they love literature. They love stories. Patrick and I did a session a couple of years ago at, what's the conference?
Chautauqua?
No.
The Spotlight or something?
No, the one you're going to talk about.
Lily?
The Lily. We did a session with the Lily about using stories in the classroom, which I know we all do. And that was fun, and just to kind of think and catalog. So what stories do I tell? And I've got to be careful because I'm getting old and I repeat myself. And so I have to say, have I mentioned this before? And then I tell my story. I'm retiring in 5 years, it'll be okay. There's that love of literature, which has nothing to do with, for example, composition instruction. And yet, English professors are pressed into composition instruction. The entire weight, I'm saying this with some humor, of the world of composition instruction is often, hoisted on us. It's interesting to note that English departments resist this in interesting ways and embrace it in other ways. Because consider, most people who study, there are people who get Ph.D.s in composition, as we know very well, but we don't have them here. And a lot of colleges don't have many. My wife is, as many of you know, an English professor at Shawnee, and they have 3 for about 5,000 students, people with actual Ph.D.s in composition. And everybody else is an English professor, kind of pressed on the surface. And so if we think about teaching that's quite a separate discipline. The pedagogy is completely different. It's also, I can confess, impossible. I can't teach students from the skills inside my own discipline and my own interest to do all of the different kinds of writing that they have to do in order to have a successful university career. I'm saying that with some humor because we get the job done halfway decently. I will observe, however, that when I taught in Canada for a year, at Memorial University in St. John's, Newfoundland, which is kind of what people think of as the butt end of Canada. Don't record that, it's too quite poor and distant, place. Guess how many composition classes they had up there? Goose egg. None. 0. The English professors up there did, as far as I could tell, no writing instruction except here's your assignment, do this. And the other side of that coin, of course, is that I discovered that my students in what would be considered like really poor Appalachia in Canadian terms were outrageously good writers. Outrageous. They thought I was a grade inflator. I had students who were doing analyses of sort of first year short stories that you would read or at a Shakespeare play. In-class analysis. And out of 40, these were large sections of 40 students, the number of students who had more than, so in a blue book for a couple of hours, number of students who had more than 3 to 5 grammar errors in that class was probably a half a dozen out of 40. And it was never more than 3 to 5. And the analyses were good. Sensible, evidence-based. It was crazy. Everybody got at least a B in that class for me. And those poor Canadian professors, I think it was just culture shock. But maybe I could have acclimated over time, but they thought I was a grade inflator. And I would have liked to, we had to leave rather precipitously for other reasons. I don't think I'm wanted in Canada anymore. I would have loved to have stayed around another year and talked with people about that and explored that a bit, because it was fascinating. And of course, what happens there is that writing instruction, as it was intended to be done here, is done at the secondary level. I'm sorry, that's my little moment, I guess, of existential complaint. We knew it would be philosophical, Paul. That's not the only thing that we do. So let me make sure I hit the 4 that I had. So I would, in my dream world, what I would do is teach art appreciation. Literature is art. I've had to remind myself of this in the last few years. It's been transformed into sometimes an anthropological experiment, a psychological experiment, sometimes it's history, it's many things. But in the ways I think that people fundamentally understand literature in its broadest sense, of course we recognize that it's art. And because I'm lucky enough to be able to teach the creative side of that as well in the writing courses that I'm able to teach, that's a direct connection for me. I see it, I try to do that as well, and so I understand it. So I teach art appreciation. That's the thing I like the best. Analysis, I love. It's really fun to get in and look at these complex works of literature and to talk about the layers and the possibilities. That's a ball with students, because I lecture very little in those discussions. I try to come up with good questions, as I know all of you do as well, and draw them out. And then it's kind of fun. And sometimes my students will teach me things. They'll read things in stories I didn't see, which is marvelous. So art appreciation, analysis, writing in all of its complexity. The art appreciation side and the analysis come with this other sort of paradigm, which is all human questions, large and small, are available through literature. All of them. A great book, a great poem, a great play, you name it. Anything a human being has ever considered, they come up there. So it's a very complex field in and of itself. Just dealing with the literature. When we move to the writing side, it's incredibly complex. I won't belabor that point, but it is. So I explained those sort of aspects of the job from my angle, because one of the things that happened to me, I never thought, I asked my wife this morning, I said, so what do you think your strengths are as a teacher? And a couple of you know Robin in this class, but she's very funny. She said, well, my students tell me is that they like my organization, the detail, there's some other things that she does very, very well. And I said, well, hold on, back up a step. So forget about your students for a moment. What do you think your strengths are as a teacher? And she said, I care. She paused for a moment and she said, I care. I thought, darn right, that's a strength. That's a great strength. And as I asked that question, I realized, I hadn't tried to answer that question for myself. Who thinks about what our strengths are as teachers in a direct way very often? I guess we might be challenged to do that from time to time, but we're too busy teaching. I'm in it. Don't ask me how I made the foul shot. I just knew I got in the hoop. I'm happy. So when I had a bad year about a year ago, I'm going to my case study now. I had a bad year, particularly composition class. It went really poorly for me, and it surprised me. I've been a good teacher throughout most of my career. I think, with limits, as we all have limits, strengths and weaknesses, but I think it's been good. And I haven't had many bad classes. I've had a few, and a lot of them were when I was younger. So this was interesting. Interesting and very disappointing for me. And there were other aspects of that. One feels that disappointment rather heavily, I think, sometimes, because we like what we do. We want to do it well for lots of good reasons. But it didn't go great. So I had to think about that. And what I realized is that I think when I was forced to think about it, I thought, one of my strengths as a teacher is that because I love books and what they do so well, and I love ideas so well, I'm always trying to inspire students. I want to be an inspirational teacher, which is a very ambitious thing. But it's perfectly fitting for an English professor to do that. If you're talking about art should be inspirational. Literary art should be, the greatest literary art is like that. I remember distinctly when I was an undergraduate and I read James Baldwin's story, Sonny's Blues, I wept at the end of the story. I actually had tears in my eyes. I'm an urban guy, so it kind of hit me sort of where I live. But that's a transformational sort of experience, to cry over a college story. And I think I've always tried, and there have been other really nice experiences I've had like that, some without tears, and that have sort of led me down that road. But so it's natural, I think, for an English professor who understands that she or he is engaged in teaching as one of the several goals I mentioned before, literary art, to want to inspire students and to seek inspiration in them through the literature and then through any observations or other things we can bring to it. So what happened to me is I started leaning on it. And what's funny about that is that some of you know I had hip replacements about 14 years ago. I'll have a revision this summer because apparently they were out. Actually, everybody. But one of the things that's sort of come up, in sort of managing that and the therapy is that I've been told by some therapists that as we get older, we have to be careful because we will become one-sided. We'll lose. This is why people do yoga, right? Because it's all about the core. Talk to Hoyt sometime about core. It's Mr. Core. But it's all about your core strength, And one of the things I started developing problems because I'm protecting what they call the prosthesis. This is what they tell you. Don't jump up and down. These things you can't do. So you're protecting prosthesis. And I've developed some problems because I became one-sided. I did my right side first and my left side second. I think by the time I got to the left side, I just kind of let it go. This has been a trailer. It's like my left side's a trailer, my right side's the engine. Right? And so you develop issues because of that. I've had some knee problems recently because of that. And I've been solving them, by the way, by understanding I have to also work this side and use this side and sort of concentrate on it. Well, I think the same thing happened with my teaching. I've been relying so heavily on the idea that it was possible to have an inspirational moment in a class, that I would design my teaching around the idea of creating inspirational moments, which often came out of discussions. And you would look for particular parts in plays or stories or poems that were capable of that. It's the literature, the nice thing about literature is that it's not the teacher that does that. You're sort of the facilitator of the thing that's already there, but you're just opening the thing up. And well, guess what happens when you look for inspirational moments all the time? You lose some instructional chops. You stop thinking about daily instruction. I had my eye on this, what I considered a noble goal, and ennobling goal. And it's not that, I'm a very experienced teacher, so I've got a lot of tricks up my sleeve, most of which I learned in grad school or stole from other professors. So we do this and we're going to do this. I know how to do 3 things at least in every class. So we move it through, keep their attention, lots of techniques like that you all used to. So I had those and I was using them, but they were kind of left-hand items. You know, I just kind of had them there, but I wasn't really concentrating on those. And in composition, you will not be surprised. Inspiration is not a great tool. You know, it's like bringing a nail file to a kitchen demo. You know, it's not a great tool. And I could work it sometimes, you know, because we have to do some reading in that class. There are other things that we talk about, but it just didn't work. So that's what happened to me, and I had to make the correction that you would all guess that I made, which is that I stopped focusing on inspiration. I said, listen, what's my goal? And I thought about myself as an undergraduate, and I thought, you know, I took a lot of different classes from a lot of different professors as an undergraduate, but one of the things I appreciated was when the day was instructionally sound. You weren't asleep. You know, your teacher wasn't lost. You know, it was instructionally sound. And if the instruction of that day was well planned and pretty well delivered and had some thought behind it and it was appropriate, you thought, great, I'm good to go. I didn't need great teachers when I was an undergraduate. I was ready to learn. I needed a good teacher who had a plan, and that did it for me. I had a couple of great teachers, but so once I did that, man, everything flipped. All of a sudden, the job became easier in a certain way because I took these expectations off the table, which is interesting. And now every day I go in and I think I plan a lot. I haven't, like many of you, I assume I have an outline. I have a daily syllabus. People know what's coming every day, but instructionally, I kind of make that up as I go. You know, what am I doing today? I think about it the day before. Sometimes I'm driving to school and I come up, hey, I'm going to do this. I had a marvelous education prof years ago who told me, we're talking about instruction, and he told me, he said, you know, every once in a while, you just got to try something you never tried before, which is, of course, scary because you're not sure that's going to work. You know, and I've done that. Sometimes it's fun, sometimes it's work. So everything came together. My students are happier. I'm happier. Everything's going better. I feel like I can have the last decade or 2/3 of a decade of my teaching, and maybe it'll be a good decade. You know, so I think in a way I've got an old guy problem in a certain way, which is fascinating to me. But the principle that I was interested in, and this is the philosophical part of this, and I'll sort of end with this idea, is that it was really surprising to me that what I would have thought of, and what I think is, at least in the context of my discipline, is a legitimate strength to talk about. Actually had the capacity, that was a weakness, or had the capacity to lead to weakness or create a weakness. Your strength can create a weakness. I was thinking of yin and yang, you know, how those things, it's part of the flow that you contain. Opposites are contained inside of things. And you know, when I was thinking about, you know, just chatting with you all, that's sort of the place I ended with. I thought, and I was thinking particularly this morning about what Ping Yuan's going to be talking about in another month, and I assume that's coming in April. Your chat. Yeah. And I think, well, those are the common problems. This one, at least for me, was not common. I was taken by surprise. But it's interesting to kind of work through that as well. You know, if I can leave you with a thought, and I don't know, part of my problem, I told my wife, I said, I don't know if this isn't discipline specific. I think my problem may have a lot to do with what I teach and the ways in which I'm trying to teach it. And it may be that in some other kinds of coursework, that this idea that a strength can become a weakness might not apply, or it might not apply as well. I don't know. That's part of what, you know, I'd be interested in hearing from anybody's thoughts, you know, the second half of this.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, I'm done now. So
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah,
no. I'm encouraging you. That's not. Yeah, that was.
I think there are three things that come together in classes: the students, the teacher, and the material.
Mm-hmm.
And those three all affect how you design it. And that's one of the issues I take with some of the online course push.
Mm-hmm.
Not every class and not every instructor and not every student meshes in that, meets in that same place.
Absolutely.
And when folks are given templates of how to teach, or they're made a facilitator, there's not that ability to adjust or to change the materials. I mean, you made a huge, almost a 180 in the middle of your course, it sounds like. And isn't that shocking when you realize, oh, it's me, you know?
I'm the problem, yeah.
Oops, I thought it was them, or,
Right.
And so I think that's very admirable that you were able to, first of all, recognize what it was, something to plow through, but then to change it. And I think we would all do well to keep that in mind with courses and things I see that are being pushed that maybe aren't appropriate.
Boy, online learning is like the 800-pound gorilla in the room.
Mm-hmm.
In so
And
many
I
ways.
enjoy it, and it's good for some classes,
Sure.
for some students, and in other times, they never consider the instructor.
Well, you're engaging in what my friend Jeff Powell, who's a philosophy professor at Marshall University, likes to call higher order thinking.
Oh.
Because look at the complexities there.
Yeah.
These are the three elements that contribute or that need to be thought of in instructional effectiveness. Look at the vicissitudes between these elements. Consider other questions and issues that may arise. And you have a complex now that if you try to simplify that and say, no, we can do this, you're automatically in trouble. But, it's fascinating. Online learning has extreme limitations if we ask it to do everything.
Mm-hmm.
It is fascinatingly effective as a public tool. The public side of that is great. The Khan Academy is wonderful.
Yeah.
At least it's free and somebody takes the time. It's great. But when we start using it for university students, of whom we have very high expectations, and we don't consider the things you're talking about, you're right. That's it.
I think it can be very effective. I mean, I have some students in some of my classes that this is the perfect, because there's nothing they like less than listen to me yammer, but they can just take it and run and go.
I'll tell you my quick hypothesis about this. When I taught at Elmira College in upstate New York, we had a form if you wanted to do an independent study. The first question on the form is, what's your GPA? Mm-hmm. And if you had under a 3.0, you didn't do an independent study because you needed to demonstrate your capacity to work independently, right? Mm-hmm. And the minute we get into the hard push for online education, we're because it's about money. It's about not paying the bricks and mortar. It's about not, I don't have to tell you, about not paying somebody's medical bills.
Mm-hmm.
It's about those things, and it's carts and horses at that point. What's your end goal?
I'm gonna try to articulate this because I think you actually leveraged your strengths extremely well in this session. It's very inspirational, so I'm gonna try to kind of put my thoughts together.
Nice.
I think that's very interesting when you said that what students perceive as our strengths may not always align with what we ourselves perceive as our strengths. But I think that that leads me to this thought that sometimes when we perceive as our strengths and we want to play with that strengths, it's kind of self-centered, right? Because that's our goal. Right?
Yes.
I want to inspire students. I want students to achieve higher level thinking, higher deep learning.
Right.
But when you read students' comments or when they kind of offhandedly just talk to you and then say I like how you organize your material, I like how you answer our questions, I like how you structure our discussion. Those things might not be what I perceive as my strengths, right? So, but then if you leverage those strengths, then it becomes a more student-centered approach to teaching. So that just kind of leads me to think when your strength becomes your weakness, but you can actually leverage what others observe as your strengths, and then actually create a more, I wouldn't say successful, but effective learning teaching moment for
Yeah, and that makes me think about also pinging on and say, we teach inside a complex of higher education. So the balance between one of the difficult things is trusting our students. if we make a student-centered classroom, we trust them in a certain way, which is difficult. And sometimes we need to be rigorous and push them. And I think about my own education. I think, one of the best classes I had, individual classes I had as an undergraduate, was a 2-hour lecture in the history of ideas, a philosophy class. And it blew my mind. It was a lecture for 2 hours. But I don't lecture very much. And lots of lectures aren't necessarily like that. And by the same token, one of the things that happens in my creative writing class, my poetry classes, the last 2 or 3 years are crazy. Because these people come in, and first of all, it's 10 people in a room like this, and A, they really, really, really want to do it. It's not a requirement. They really want this. They're hungry for it. B, they are remarkably with some limitations around this. They're remarkably creative. They write interesting stuff very quickly. It doesn't take a lot of instruction to get them there. They're very passionate. They've got problems and they want to get them out. A lot of stuff like that, like most writers do. So sometimes I find I have to back off. I have to trust them. They're in this moment smarter than my instructional methodology for a while, and then I have to come back. It's like so that balance is interesting. So when do we push? When do we lecture? Sometimes I apologize for my lectures all the time. I say I'm sorry for that mini lecture because I usually give mini lectures. But by the same time, I do that more now than I ever have before because I kind of think they need it in some ways at the same time. That balance is fascinating, isn't it? Oh, I'm sorry, to finish that thought. I figured out 5 years ago, because I'm a slow learner, that my classes don't matter. The change that higher education seeks to accomplish, they matter. I'm simplifying. The change that higher ed seeks to accomplish, think about it in your own lives. What were we like when we were first-year students? And by the time we were seniors, we were a lot more sophisticated. We knew a lot more. And it was all those classes in the aggregate that sort of did that for me. So I'm a little piece of a fairly large jigsaw. And that is really interesting. That's something I think about a lot. And when I think about my instructional limitations, I think, well, I know I'm this kind. For example, have you ever had the chance to see Juana teach English? He's a very dynamic teacher. He's somewhat different from me, which is really good. But and I'm impressed when I watch him teach. And but he's definitely different from me. He chooses different books. He goes at them in slightly different ways, that kind of thing. And I think that my weaknesses or limitations as an instructor, because of my choices and my preferences and my interests, are not really weaknesses, because it's only together that Juana and I make a better single figurative English professor. Together we make one pretty good English professor. But isn't that what a department's for? And then together we teach this way, our colleague next door teaches that way, someone else has a different, and then together we get there, and then you spread that out to the whole 4 years of the degree, and then you see the change. Because it's wonderful to meet people as first years and then see them leaving in their senior year. It's fabulous. That's why we're here, isn't it? I think, at least in part, just watching that transformation is incredible. Talking too much, I'm sorry. Excitable boy, my wife says.
So the starting place is to try to analyze your strengths as an instructor.
As crazy as that may sound.
Yeah, and I guess I'm wondering, because that requires introspection, and I'm wondering, could you miss something? And maybe that's where, relying on, as you said, because I was thinking of the question I was going to ask. I realized that you kind of came up with a bit of an answer to it, but now I've kind of lost my train of thought. I'm an old guy.
You're retiring soon too.
Yeah,
but I was like, when I was trying to formulate a question, I was like trying to think of my own strengths, like what would I identify as my strengths, and I'm like, I really come up with like one or two descriptions of my strengths. I'm kind of control freak, I'm OCD, so I want everything to be organized. Maybe that's a strength, and students have reflected on that.
Sure.
Everything's well organized, but to what extent is that a strength to like reach a higher goal of like I want my students to learn to be more analytical, to read more critically, to this and that, and so like there is like sometimes a disconnect or a misalignment between what I think I am good at and what it actually turns out to be an effective teaching approach or a strategy. But that's really interesting because recently I heard there's a story from a friend in Taiwan. His daughter is like 5 or 6 years old. We're close to first grade, and she was in school. There's a homework, like an assignment in class, and then she brings that home. And it is a question: what is your greatest strength? Okay, to this like first grader, she put down 2. One, it was recommended by her teacher, saying that you have good penmanship. How about that? And she was like, okay, I have good penmanship. The second one was hers. I can imitate bird calls. And I'm like, that is awesome because I can, right? And then so what she sees like in the 6-year-old mind as her strengths is totally different from this adult's, perspective that, okay, you write well, So it's that kind of, that story really stuck with me because I'm like, wow, like, without these social, like impositions from social norms that, individuals have great potentials.
Yes.
So, but like we are kind of, right, as teachers are kind of constrained in this norm of, higher education, and there are suggestions for us to do this and that, but then also like when you come to think of how students look at us and how students perceive as our strengths, like you can see that mismatch as well. That's very interesting.
It is. You're both right. It's you can miss something because it's hard to see, and then it's hard to analyze what you think you know. Even if we were successful in isolating what we think our strengths are, and then trying to anticipate as an implied lesson from what happened to me might indicate that. So how can this become something negative someday? It's like, well, it's kind of hard to see. I stumped my wife, and she's pretty smart. So it's a double whammy. First, you have to try and see, and then what do you do after that? Have you ever watched yourself film when you teach? I had the unfortunate. I unfortunately had to watch myself playing music a few times. It's like, oh my god! And in my head, you got these habits, and you're doing things that people are watching me do this all the time. But I think, as of course in education, we force students to do that stuff, right? That you have to sort of film themselves as part of the student teaching. Boy, I think film yourself, film ourselves teaching, and then do the self-critique. If we can stand it.
In the vein of recognizing your own strengths and others having different perspectives, I sometimes feel a little tension between what I think are my strengths and the strengths that perhaps students value more than the ones that I think are important. So I sort of feel like I'm constantly doing a balancing act between broccoli and dessert. You know what I mean? Here's what you really need, and I think I have some strengths in delivering that, but I find that's not always the thing that they like, and maybe there's something else so I try to put in a little that they like, and it's always a balancing act, I feel like.
Do you sometimes feel like you have to justify to them why you're doing the harder part?
Yes, I do.
I've started doing that a little bit with one of my classes where I tell them why I designed this exercise, and I tell them, I want you to get a little frustrated with this one because, that edginess will help it really, resonate with you, and so I'm kind of hoping to screw it up and telling them, and they seem more.
I did that today, as a matter of fact, and Christine is aware of what I did today in class because I won't bore you with the exercise, but her granddaughter was kind enough to record herself reading a passage and my student had to analyze it, and they can't keep up, and it's the first time, and they get very frustrated and they're afraid they're doing it wrong and all of this. And so I had to do that very thing. Here's why we're doing it, here's what I expect, and trying to soothe anxieties about it, you know. So, and sometimes, frankly, some of the things they have to learn are not very exciting.
Yeah.
But they still need them. So I try, and so I think maybe even though I might think a strength would be the great way I got them to do that, maybe. And so, but sometimes I find that the things that they value are not things that I really planned.
You know, the former Southern Governor Lester Maddox once said that we're not going to get better prisons till we get a better grade of prisoner.
I never thought I would hear Lester.
Much less by a Clevelander. But you know, I was harkening back to my experience teaching in Canada and just thinking about universities and expectations and the quality of students. And you know, it's really interesting to think about that. It's our. Let's imagine a world. This will be extreme, but perhaps partly accurate. Let's imagine a world in which most college students coming to a state university in a place like Ohio are underprepared. Or certainly, let's say most college students coming to a state university with an open admissions policy like we have are underprepared. And then let's further suppose, well, if we think about our own standards and what we think higher ed ought to do for people, they're really rather massively underprepared. That's just a hypothetical, but all right, so they are. How does that affect the teacher? You're going to be depressed. You're going to think, I can't. What do I have to do? Stand on my head? You know, you're saying, you know, not sinking in, texting. You know, can't write. You know, there's no motivation, even sometimes, or the motivation is slightly askew. You know, consider our campus as a fascinating example of this. I mean, we have a blend between what is really not even a community college curriculum. It's a technical college, community college, technical students, two-year school curriculum. And the gap between that very valuable training and the much more, let's say at least complex thing that higher ed is, a four-year higher ed degree is supposed to do for people, the gap between that is almost insurmountable when you throw them together. It's oil and water. It's like almost impossible. We do a pretty good job of it, frankly, but that doesn't mean that it's a success. And it doesn't mean that we're enjoying it, you know, in that sense. But that's the context. This is where you are. Just like if you took some champion swimmer and said, okay, there's you know, the Cuyahoga River on fire. Go for it. You know. You swim through the bilge in a catacomb somewhere. How you doing? How's your time?
But you actually stole the phrase I was going to include in my question, which really, when you talk about instruction as we do it, there really is a chemistry between the instructor and the student. And there are lots of aspects to that, but we've been talking also about introspection and self-awareness about what you bring to the classroom situation. But it's even not necessarily the unpreparedness of the students, it's the instructor's willingness to, or apprehension of their level of preparedness. I'm going to tell you this story. This story was told to me by my advisor, and she took a graduate class in psychology from an expert statistician. His name was Wary.
That's a good name for a statistician.
Yeah. And all of the graduate students, because you're required to take statistics at the graduate level, as well as at the graduate level in psychology. And so all of these graduate students went to this guy's class, and he talked about statistics, and it was, almost every lecture was over their heads. They didn't get it, you know. And in fact, the name they all came up with for this guy's class was Wary's Mystery Hour. The problem this guy had was that he knew his material so well that he actually could not think, he could not really get down to the level that his students needed for them to understand what he was talking about. He was talking about all of this abstract stuff that he understood so well, and they just didn't understand him. They didn't understand what he was saying. And so
That's huge.
Yeah. But I guess it behooves us to be introspective and self-reflective and think about where the points at which we meet our students. I guess.
Yeah, I mean, we've all heard that you meet students where they are.
Yeah.
And,
But they got to bring something to the game.
They
too.
got to bring a lot to the game. There are serious limits to that.
And don't you find too that sometimes the first few weeks are just figuring out who this group is? They're changing. I'm seeing a big difference in the students now than a few years ago.
Yes, absolutely.
And that's,
I spent a
that's
while
another problem
figuring
with the online teaching.
It's harder.
Harder to do that.
Oh, yeah.
Actually, I was just in the Netherlands, and I was in because my wife had a conference there, and we were at a dinner, and one of her young colleagues, in a conversation at dinner, asked me about, because it became evident that I was an older teacher. She's young, and she
A
asked me
senior lecturer.
how have the students changed? Can you tell me how the populations of students have changed over the years? And I had to pause and think about that.
I have too small a sample.
Yeah, well, maybe.
What
But
did you tell? What did you say?
Well, I said, yeah. Well, I said, well, there are two things that have changed. There's been me and the students.
Yeah.
Because when I was younger and teaching, obviously I shared more in common with them, and there was that. And so as I've gotten older, there's that generation gap phenomenon. But I think she was really kind of trying to look at changes in generational changes. And it sounds like that's what you were kind of alluding to.
Yeah, there's some of that too. But so, what did you share with her as a difference?
Oh, I kind of winged it, and I said, well, yeah, there are these millennials, and obviously their experiences as a cohort of individuals in terms of familiarity with technology has changed, and I did that kind of stuff. But I know there's literature out there on the changes of students over the years.
And we find too the mix between traditional and non-traditional shifts, and that makes a big difference in a class. Like whenever I have a lot of people coming through where the trades are paying for their tuition, I get a lot of older, more mature students, and then when the economy changes, I get a lot of these and so it's a lot of times it's a long. It takes me a while,
Yeah.
a couple of weeks to really narrow down where are these guys.
It seems to me that the whole category of non-traditional student has become so heterogeneous that
Yeah.
What?
Yeah.
and it's
What is it?
difficult for me in the social science survey courses because you can't come up with any common experience to use as an illustration. They don't have any common experience,
Well, that's one thing I was going to say. That one thing that I have seen, not so much. It's been so gradual that I haven't been aware of it over my own students. But looking back to the people that I went to school with, and then seeing the gradual change, I think what you said about common experience is one thing that really has changed because, sure, our students they have a shared culture, which is different from the older people's culture, but still it's not shared culture in the same sense that it used to be. You used to be able to, I think, count on a certain core of common knowledge that almost everybody had, from knowledge of the local
Beatles.
well, and even academic knowledge, because the same things were taught in school, and so you could expect people who graduated in high school to know these kinds of things. And also, I think the cohorts of students who actually go to college is much broader. So you used to have people from a particular social strata, a little bit more economic, and they did have more of a shared growing up and experience as a citizen. And now we get people from so many walks of life and so many situations, and we all used to watch the same television shows, listen to the same music. They're all over the place now, so I don't think you can count on this shared core of reference that you used to be able to have.
Remember those 60s movies where the teacher, I don't think it was a college professor very often, would end up being a social worker?
I'm sorry,
Like
I'm not old enough
To
to
Sir
remember
with
that.
Love would be one example that comes to mind, or something like that. But there was an 80s movie called Teachers.
Yes.
They like that.
Yeah.
And you do find, apropos of that, that I find I'm a social worker a lot more than I ever thought I would be, and I try not to be. it's really good to try not to be in a way, but
And you're not licensed.
exactly. So exactly, I don't want to try that at home.
You know, that what you said about the TV, though, I've often thought that we used to have this common
There were only
experience.
3
Yeah, there were
channels. How
only
many
3
choices
channels,
did you have?
and the one never really came in very well. So you really did have a shared evening experience with everyone else, and a common form of reference. And now that's not there, and I don't know if that's good or bad.
And I'm seeing
But
this
it's
across the
different.
culture. They just come from very different backgrounds. They do very different things when they leave the university. So anything that you could say to build empathy or shared culture with one group doesn't fit another group. So you have to find a lot of things that cross groups or have a lot of different frames of reference yourself to be able to relate to everybody in that personal way that we're talking about.
I know I was making references to the Arab Spring in the context of something we were talking about, and I paused and saw this completely. I mean, I'm not referring to, when I was young. I mean,
Like the Prague Spring, you think it would be.
and the blank, and I'm, stuck for another example.
And it's not just because it was not current. It's because everybody wasn't tuned in. to
Right,
that.
exposure
Uh-huh.
to media has now grown
These
so large.
segmented markets.
Right.
Yes,
Yes,
because
that's
they
what I
can
was
self,
trying to
sort of isolate and just tune into one segment of culture.
Mm-hmm.
And like I had to talk about the Crimean War in the middle of the 19th century yesterday, and if you hadn't heard of Crimea 2 years ago, that's okay. But today, you must have heard Crimea mentioned at least once, right? Somewhere.
Yeah, and the answer is no. We haven't.
Right.
We're running out of time, Paul.
Got a few more minutes left. I liked what you said earlier about the trying new things in your classroom, either new content or new instructional methods, and sometimes it is absolutely terrifying as the instructor to do that, but I think it's like a necessary evil. I was recently looking at my lectures for college composition for the library research aspect of that course, and even just over the last 2 years, it's unrecognizable how much my own instruction has changed just in 2 years. And it really made me think that, especially as a librarian, the information needs that students have today and my skill set at teaching that gap in knowledge is going to be completely different than what the students have in 5 years. And it's a little scary thinking about that I'm, I consider myself very good at finding information, but being able to come down to a freshman's level can be very challenging. It can be very challenging.
It's a noble job.
Yeah.
Somebody has to do it. Yeah, and I don't know what the answer is. Fascinating. I had one of my philosophy professors, the same one who gave me that lecture. He might have even said it in that lecture. He said, from his point of view, this was a Czechoslovakian engineer. He was an engineer in the Czech Republic, or I guess it was Czechoslovakia back then, and came to this country, or is it the other way? Came to this country, got a Ph.D. in philosophy, and then so he was a smart guy. And he told us, he said, from what I can see, you study history, study the fall of Rome, you study the rise and fall of civilizations and cultures and at the global level. He said, from what I can see, we're kind of on the downward slide now. he said, but I say just relax and kind of enjoy the ride. But I don't agree. I'm a romantic, not that kind of person. But what you're talking about, Paul, is the keep up game. Mm-hmm. Keep up technology, keep up learning methodology, keep up teaching methodology, keep up cultural. It's the exponential explosion of keep up items on our plates just as citizens is huge. And as teachers, it's, triple. It's crazy. It's amazing we surf it all in waves like this. I used the metaphor. Sorry.
Well, thank you very much for talking to us today.